An angry stranger storms into a cafe pointing fingers at Barron Trump. What happens next leaves everyone questioning their own assumptions. It was a breezy afternoon in the heart of Philadelphia, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the corner cafe. Inside, a gentle hum of conversation blended with the clinking of cups, creating a warm, inviting atmosphere. Seated by the window, Barron Trump sat quietly at a small table, his tall frame slightly hunched over a thick book. Dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, he wasn't trying to draw attention. If anything, he was hoping to blend in. He had come for a simple reason, a moment of quiet. As the youngest son of a former president, his life had been a whirlwind of public scrutiny and appearances. But here, among strangers sipping lattes and scrolling through their phones, he felt an unusual sense of anonymity. Barron was engrossed in his book when a sudden, sharp voice sliced through the cafe's hum. "Do you think you're better than the rest of us?" The voice was loud, forceful, and filled with resentment. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned toward the man standing a few feet away from Barron's table. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a weathered face and a fiery expression. His clothes weren't ragged, but they carried the unmistakable wear of someone who had seen hard times. His posture was tense, his fists clenched. For a moment, Barron froze, not out of fear, but out of surprise. This wasn't what he had anticipated when he chose this cafe for a quiet afternoon. The tension in the room thickened. The barista behind the counter hesitated, her hand hovering near the phone. "You've had everything handed to you on a silver platter," the man continued, his voice trembling with anger. "Do you even know what it's like to struggle?" The cafe patrons exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. Barron, however, remained calm. He slowly closed his book, placing it neatly on the table, and looked up at the man. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but quiet, "I'm not sure what's upset you, but maybe we could talk about it." The man scoffed loudly. "Talk? You want to talk? What could you possibly have to say that someone like me would want to hear?" The cafe fell eerily silent. People waited, holding their breath, anticipating what would happen next. But instead of matching the man's aggression, Barron did something no one expected. Something that changed everything. Barron leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed yet attentive. The man's anger seemed to pulse through the room, making even those watching from afar feel uneasy. But Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please, sit," he said calmly, his tone disarming. The unexpected offer took the man aback. He hesitated, his shoulders still rigid with tension. He stood there, fists still clenched, glaring down at Barron. "Where would I want to sit with someone like you?" the man sneered. "You're just another spoiled kid who'll never know what it's like to live in the real world." A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to one another. The barista made a subtle movement as if considering whether to step in, but Barron kept his composure. "Maybe you're right," Barron admitted, his voice measured. "I haven't walked in your shoes, but if you sit down, maybe you can tell me what that's like." For a second, the man seemed to falter. The firmness in Barron's voice wasn't a challenge. It was an invitation. Yet instead of taking the seat, the man leaned in closer, his voice lowering but still sharp. "You think I owe you my story? You think that'll make you feel better about yourself?" he snapped. Barron shook his head. "No," he replied simply. "I don't think you owe me anything. But I'd like to hear it anyway." Something shifted in the man's expression. His anger wavered, replaced by something else. Hesitation, maybe even curiosity. After a long pause, he let out a breath he had been holding. With a slow, reluctant movement, he pulled out the chair and sat down. The cafe, still wrapped in stunned silence, watched as an unexpected conversation began to unfold. No one knew exactly what was said between the two. The man spoke in hushed tones, his words carried only to Barron, who listened intently, occasionally nodding. The heated confrontation had transformed into something different, something human. Minutes passed, then half an hour. The cafe patrons who had once been frozen in anticipation slowly returned to their own conversations, though many stole glances at the unlikely pair. When the man finally stood, his expression had changed. There was no more hostility, no clenched fists. He looked at Barron, his eyes softer, and nodded. Barron nodded back. No dramatic gestures, no need for grand conclusions. Just a quiet understanding. The man walked toward the door, and before stepping out, he turned back for a moment. "Thanks for listening, kid." And with that, he was gone. The cafe's hum resumed, but something about the room felt different. A moment of tension had turned into a moment of connection, one that no one had expected. As Barron picked up his book again, the barista exhaled and whispered to a coworker, "I don't think anyone saw that coming." Neither did anyone else, but one thing was certain. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't to argue, it's to listen. An unexpected conversation that changed everything. Dripping with sarcasm, the man's gaze burned with resentment, but Barron's eyes didn't waver. "I think everyone has a story that deserves to be heard," Barron said, his voice steady. His words hung in the air, cutting through the silence like a knife. The man hesitated, as if torn between lashing out again or accepting the unexpected civility. Around them, other customers continued to watch, their curiosity now mingled with an odd sense of hope. They weren't sure where this was heading, but they couldn't look away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man grabbed the back of the empty chair across from Barron and dragged it noisily across the floor. The sound echoed through the cafe as he dropped into the seat, crossing his arms defensively. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning Barron as if searching for a crack in his calm demeanor. "Fine," he muttered. "You want to hear about the real world? I'll tell you." The tension in the cafe shifted, not entirely gone, but no longer suffocating. The barista, who had been subtly hovering near the phone, lowered her hand. The other patrons leaned in slightly, pretending not to eavesdrop, but hanging on every word. Barron nodded, leaning forward just a little. "I'm listening." And so the man began to speak. But what came next wasn't just a story. It was a revelation. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as if trying to steady himself. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but no less raw. "You look at me and see someone angry for no reason. But you don't know what it's like to lose everything." His words were heavy with bitterness. He glanced around the cafe as if daring anyone to interrupt before turning his gaze back to Barron. "I had a job, a family, a decent life. Then the factory I worked at shut down, just like that, gone. Hundreds of us left with nothing but empty promises that they'd relocate us, promises that never came true." The cafe was silent, save for the faint sound of the espresso machine hissing in the background. The man's voice began to crack as he continued, his tough exterior crumbling with each sentence. "I tried to hold it together for my wife and kids, took whatever odd jobs I could find. But when you're scraping by, it doesn't take much to break you." He paused, his eyes glistening. "My wife, she left, took the kids with her, said she couldn't live like this anymore." He swallowed hard, staring down at the table. "I can't even blame her." Barron remained silent, his face unreadable, but there was no mistaking the empathy in his eyes. The man exhaled shakily, his fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table absently, as if trying to ground himself. "Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and know everyone is looking at you, judging you, thinking you're nothing? That's my life now, every single day." His words hit hard, not just for Barron, but for everyone listening. A woman at a nearby table shifted uncomfortably, suddenly engrossed in her coffee cup, as if trying to process what she had just heard. And then I see someone like you," the man continued, his voice rising slightly, "sitting here with your fancy clothes, reading a book like you don't have a care in the world. And it makes me mad because no matter what I do, I'll never have what you have." The weight of his frustration filled the air, thick and unrelenting. But Barron didn't rush to fill the silence. He let the man's pain settle, respecting its weight. Finally, after a long pause, he leaned forward, his elbows resting lightly on the table. "I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes," Barron said softly. "But I do know what it's like to feel judged, to feel like people have already decided who you are before you've even said a word." The man looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What could you possibly know about that?" Barron's response wasn't what anyone in the cafe expected. It turned the conversation and the entire mood of the room in a way no one could have predicted. He took a deep breath, his steady composure making the tension feel less suffocating. He met the man's skeptical glare with unwavering eyes. "You might think I've got it easy because of my name," Barron said. "And in some ways you're right. I've never had to worry about a roof over my head or food on the table. But that doesn't mean I don't know what it's like to feel misunderstood." The man scoffed, ready to argue, but Barron continued. "People assume they know me before I even open my mouth. They decide what kind of person I must be because of who my father is. They expect me to be a certain way, act a certain way, think a certain way. And when I don't fit into their expectations, they get angry." The cafe was completely still. Even those who had initially been indifferent to the scene unfolding before them were now riveted. The man blinked, something in his expression shifting. The fire in his eyes dimmed just slightly, replaced by something else. Reflection, maybe. "Joe, yeah," Barron finished. "I don't know your struggles. But I do know what it's like to have people see you as something you're not." The man stared at him for a long moment, then with a slow exhale, he leaned back in his chair. For the first time since he had stormed into the cafe, his posture softened. And then something remarkable happened. The man nodded, just once. A silent acknowledgement. "Yeah," he muttered. "Maybe we're not so different after all." And just like that, the air in the cafe shifted once more. Not with tension, but with understanding. No one saw it coming, but perhaps that's what made it matter the most. An unexpected encounter that changed everything. The man looked ready to interrupt, but Barron held up a hand, not in a dismissive way, but as if to say, "Hear me out." "Everywhere I go, people make assumptions about me," Barron continued. "They think they know who I am, what I believe, what I've done, just because of my last name. They don't see me as a person, they see a caricature, someone they can project their own frustrations onto, kind of like what's happening here." The man's face twitched, as if Barron's words had struck a nerve. He didn't respond immediately, but his posture shifted slightly, his arms loosening from their defensive cross. Barron's tone remained measured but genuine. "I'm not saying my struggles are the same as yours. They're not. But pain is pain. Feeling like you're invisible, like you'll never be understood, that's something we all face, no matter where we come from." The cafe was utterly silent now, the kind of silence thick with thought. Even the barista had stopped mid-step, her tray of cups momentarily forgotten. Barron leaned back slightly, giving the man space to absorb what he had just said. "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm not even here to change your mind. I just want to understand, because I think we're all carrying things that no one else sees, and maybe, just maybe, we'd be a little kinder to each other if we did." The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed like he might lash out again, but then he exhaled sharply, as if releasing something heavy he had been holding on to for far too long. "You really believe that?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost unsure. Barron nodded. "I do, and I think, maybe deep down, you do too. Otherwise you wouldn't have told me your story." The man blinked, his tough exterior cracking just a little more. He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around the cafe as if noticing for the first time how many people were watching. A flicker of self-consciousness crossed his face, but then he looked back at Barron. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, his tone softer now. But the real surprise wasn't in what Barron said next. It was in what the man did in response. He sat back in his chair, his body language shifting from guarded to contemplative. For a long moment he didn't say anything. The cafe remained still, every patron caught in the quiet tension of the moment. Finally he spoke, his voice stripped of its earlier hostility. I came in here mad at the world," he said, shaking his head. "Mad at people like you, who I thought had it all handed to them. But maybe I've been carrying that anger too long. Maybe it's not about you at all." Barron didn't respond right away. He let the man's words hang in the air, giving them the weight they deserved. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and measured. "I think it's easy to blame people we don't know," Barron said. "It's harder to face what's really hurting us. But you did that today, and I respect that." The man looked up, his eyes meeting Barron's for the first time. There was no trace of anger now, only a weary kind of gratitude. "You're a good kid," he said, almost reluctantly, as if the admission cost him something. "I don't say that often." The shift in tone was palpable. The tension that had gripped the cafe dissolved, replaced by an unexpected sense of connection. The barista smiled faintly as she resumed her work. A couple at a nearby table exchanged glances, their expressions softening. Then the man did something that caught everyone off guard. He reached across the table, his hand outstretched. Barron hesitated for only a second before clasping it firmly. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice thick with emotion, "for judging you before I even knew you." Barron smiled, a genuine expression that lit up his face. "And I'm sorry if I ever gave you a reason to feel that way." The handshake lingered for a moment before the man pulled back. He stood, smoothing his shirt awkwardly, then glanced around the cafe. "I think I owe everyone here an apology too," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "I came in here angry, but this kid, he reminded me that sometimes we've just got to listen." The cafe erupted in quiet applause, not loud or showy, but heartfelt. The man nodded, visibly moved, and made his way to the door. He paused just before leaving and looked back at Barron. "Thank you," he said simply, and then he was gone. What happened next wasn't dramatic, but it left a lasting impact on everyone in that cafe. The conversations that followed were softer, more thoughtful. The barista served the next round of drinks with a little more warmth in her smile. Even the patrons who had simply been bystanders left with something to think about. As Barron picked up his book again, he felt the weight of the moment settle around him. He hadn't set out to change anyone's mind that day. He had only wanted to read in peace. But sometimes, the most unexpected conversations become the ones that matter most. A moment of understanding. As the door closed behind the man, the cafe seemed to exhale collectively. Conversation slowly resumed, but something had shifted. There was a new energy in the room, a shared understanding among strangers who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Barron returned to his seat, picked up his book, and took a sip of his now cold tea. But before he could fully retreat into his solitude, a woman from a nearby table approached. She appeared to be in her 60s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "You man," she said softly. "I just want to say that what you did back there was remarkable. You didn't have to listen to him, but you did. And I think you reminded all of us that sometimes kindness is all it takes to turn things around." Barron nodded, his expression humble. "Thank you, ma'am. I think we all just want to be heard." The woman smiled and returned to her table, leaving Barron to his thoughts. Around him, the cafe buzzed with a different kind of energy. Patrons were smiling at each other, striking up conversations and offering small gestures of kindness, holding doors, sharing smiles, even picking up tabs. By the time Barron left the cafe, the day felt brighter, not just for him, but for everyone who had been part of that moment. The man's anger, Barron's empathy, and the simple act of listening had created a ripple effect of understanding and compassion. As Barron walked down the street, he couldn't help but think about how small actions could have such a big impact. He didn't know the man's full story, and he probably never would. But in that cafe, for those few moments, they had connected, and that connection had changed the tone of an entire room. Maybe that's all it takes sometimes, Barron thought to himself. Just a little bit of empathy to remind us we're not so different after all. This story isn't just about Barron or the man he met that day. It's about all of us. The way we carry our struggles, the way we judge others, and the way we can choose to listen instead of react. In today's world, where misunderstandings and judgments often divide us, Barron Trump's response to anger with empathy serves as a powerful lesson. Instead of reacting defensively, he chose to listen, transforming hostility into understanding. This reminds us that behind every angry voice is often a deeper struggle. In our daily lives, we can practice patience, seek to understand others before judging, and engage in meaningful conversations rather than conflict. A small act of kindness, like listening without prejudice, can change someone's perspective, and maybe even their life. Choose empathy, and you might turn an argument into an opportunity for connection. If this story inspired you, take a moment today to show a little kindness. And if you enjoy stories like this, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Together, we can foster more understanding and compassion, one story at a time.